Hey guys, welcome to another MapleStory 2 video, and today's not going to be a guide video, but instead it's going to be a discussion type of video. The past few that I've done so far have pretty much all been instructional guide videos on the game. But I understand many of you viewers are new to my channel, and I also do enjoy making discussion or podcast types of videos, so I hope you don't mind. I like these videos a lot, just because they're more of a casual type of content that I could put on my channel, and I'm also a huge fan of discussion and dialogue, not only hearing my thoughts about the game, but also just hearing what you guys think, you know? The things that I talk about, they're usually controversial or food for thought. If they're not serious enough for me to talk about, then I wouldn't make a video on them. And I can understand that these videos could cause arguments and disagreements, but just to let you guys know, I don't make these videos necessarily to post what I want them to do or what I think they should do, but more to just give you guys something to think about. The goal of these types of videos usually is to increase awareness in the community, not really to protest my desires. Having said that, the topic of this video is about the fair fight system. Just a quick explanation as to what the fair fight system is for those of you who don't know. It's a buff on monsters that lower the damage of players higher level than them. Mostly it's used as a means to prevent bosses from being completely steamrolled in like a few seconds. And I usually like to explain my TLDR thoughts right out the gate. I think the fair fight system can work in this game, as it has done in the past. However, the way Nexon's using it right now is not the right way to execute it. Before I get into it, I want to ask you guys, or at least encourage you to watch the entire video before you post a comment if you do plan to respond. Since this is a pretty popular debated topic in the MS2 community, I want you to fully hear me out before you make any assumptions that I'm taking aside. I'm a naturally gray and neutral person. I like to look at both sides of the story before I come up with my judgment. I also like to give people, and by extension companies, the benefit of the doubt that they've had the best intentions. I don't think there's ever existed a single video game company in the world who willingly puts bad things into their game. Every feature they add, every mechanic they implement, every system they patch in is probably justified in one way or another in their opinions. To us it may be something bad, but to them they think maybe it was a good idea. Now occasionally the player base can be very unhappy with these changes, but I like to think that Nexon had some reasoning behind it, and I do see it actually. I don't support the fair fight system, but I'm not entirely against it either, and I think you guys should also consider why it's important instead of just vehemently crucifying it, although I do understand why it can be frustrating at times. But at the same time, MapleStory 2, it's a great game. It's got an amazing release, and I think there's so many good features about the game, and something like the fair fight system I consider to be more of a nitpick than anything else. But being a decently hardcore player myself, there are instances where I don't find it to be very fun, just because it kind of gets in the way. So I'll start with why I think it's a good idea, and don't worry, I'll get to the cons later on, but let's just go to the pros. Fair fight, it's a legitimate way to stave off the power creep, the ever ubiquitous stigma of video games, especially in RPGs. RPGs are a numbers game. When it comes to numbers, whoever has the higher numbers just straight up wins most of the time, on paper anyway, conceptually. Having even a slight advantage in stats can create polarizing levels of imbalance in the game. That's just how RPGs are. If you pit an army of 1,001 people versus an army of 1,000 people, assuming they had equal circumstances, equal supplies, equal weapons, equal skill, the 1,001 army would always win just because they have one extra person. Bosses go from being super difficult to brain dead easy by just upgrading your equipment. That's the whole point, right? But when stronger gear comes out, people will be able to upgrade their equipment to the new ones and then be able to insta-kill every boss that was originally really difficult to kill before the new gear was introduced. Take MapleStory 1 for example. When Tyrant gear and Chaos Through the Abyss gear first came out, they were super expensive, like 5 billion mesos each, and Tyrants were like 15 bill clean. But in a matter of a few months, after Magnus became more and more easy to kill and Chaos Through the Abyss became easier to kill, they went down to being like 50 mil a piece, and Tyrants went down to like 600 mil. And that's because they became exponentially easier to take down. Once the very first time you take out that boss, you get to equip the new drops and then use those drops to take out the boss even faster. By having the fair fight system, it essentially in a sense acts as a means of preventing the power ceiling from going way too high to the point where players who do have that gear would just be on a whole different level than players who don't have that gear. And the next one is that it serves as a limitation for quantity. Other than the strength of each individual player, the difficulty in MMORPGs can easily be stifled with just having lots and lots of bodies, like taking on a boss with 10 people versus taking on a boss with 1,000 people. Other games do employ some nuanced version of the fair fight system by increasing the maximum HP of a boss, for example, in a dungeon based on the number of players. Like let's say we have a boss with 10,000 HP, for every additional player that comes in after the first, the HP goes up by 2,000 more. So while overall the boss is a little bit harder to kill, it's nowhere near equated to the total amount of DPS added per character joining, which means that there is still a noticeable speed increase in how quickly you take out that boss with more players. It's fair enough to where everyone had equal opportunity to deal damage to qualify for drops in experience though. And this is kind of a follow-up for the first point that I talked about, where it maintains content longevity. Since, as I said earlier, new content that comes out is meant to be very difficult to complete, so for a long period of time, it's one of those goals or unachievable dreams. But the second that content is completed, it becomes way too easy to farm since the drops you get from that content make that content way easier to do, which is, like I said, kind of the point. But very commonly, it tends to render that content obsolete, where after you do it like maybe 1, 2, or 3 more times, you never have to do it ever again. And that kind of eliminates like the value of it just because you lose all sense of achievement or incentive to do it. Fair Fight, it just makes it so it still takes work and effort to complete that dungeon, and even if it's a little bit easier due to getting overall better gear, it doesn't mean you could just like steamroll it over right away. Now that's all I can really think of why it's good to have. Now why it's not good to have, and I'm sure you guys care more about the cons, I'll get right into it. Completing content initially, it's an achievement, but afterwards it just becomes tedious. You know, after taking out a boss the first time and maybe 2 or 3 more times after, any further attempts at defeating the boss is treated as routine. Like in MapleStory 2, there's a 30 dungeon quota that you have to meet per week. And that's how you try to get those dungeons done. Some dungeons are relatively easy to complete at base level. Take Tronic's Bunker, you only need about 1500 gear score to have access to it, and at baseline it only takes about 5 to 7 minutes to beat Tronic's Bunker per run, which is not bad at all. Having higher gear score will just bring it down to about 3 to 5 minutes per run. But the higher you go, the longer dungeons will take just because they're harder. Hard mode dungeons at base 2100 gear score can sometimes take 20 minutes to complete, and gear score will only bring it down to maybe around 10 minutes or so at best, unless you're running a heavily optimized team. If we average that out, that's a pretty noticeable amount of time, 15 minutes. You have to spend over 7 hours per week to meet your 30 dungeon quota. Sure, the first time you take out Balrog or Fire Dragon or Magnus, you feel good, because you just overcame a new obstacle, but then now you have to do it 29 times more, and even with better gear, the time is still relatively the same. It becomes extremely tedious, especially when you do dungeons on multiple characters. Hypothetically speaking, if you were to do 30 dungeons on 3 characters per week, you'd have to do 90 dungeons, and averaging about 15 minutes per run, you have to spend 1350 minutes, which is 23 hours per week. And that's only to do dungeons. Just imagine how much time you'd have to spend on the game to do your other daily quests and stuff. Of course, the rewards are pretty good, but at that point it's so time consuming that people really just don't want to get all 30 of them done, myself included. There's no incentive to get stronger. Why waste energy and effort trying to raise your gear score from 2100 to 3300 if the time it takes to complete that dungeon stays relatively the same? Casual players may not care much about the Fair Fight system because it doesn't really impact their rate of progression, but hardcore players who want to get through the endgame content as fast as they can are for all intents and purposes prevented from doing so, or at least inhibited on how quickly they can progress because you're essentially putting a speed limit on the game. And I do understand that's the point of the Fair Fight system, to prevent people from going way too far out of control and being too strong and overall increasing the general rate at which the community gets through the game. Because the second that content is easy to complete, players can easily do it over and over again, get the drops that are yielded, and then sell them to other players so that they can get the drops, and then they can sell the drops for cheaper and cheaper because they're so much easier to get, so the supply goes up and the demand goes down, which is bad for the economy and the longevity of that content. But without that sense of achievement, no one is going to want to do things because there's no feeling of accomplishment. Players will do them anyway, but we're not going to be happy doing it. You've got to give them a reason to take this content on. I understand it could be scary that after they tear open the door, they've just like released the Kraken or something, but it's better than not opening the door at all. It's a lazy way to handle power creep. You know, my first point about why the Fair Fight can work is that it can stifle the power creep from going way too fast by adding kind of a proverbial speed limit on the game. But there's many better ways to do that. Hard dungeons are always guaranteed to yield like 3 to 4 epic drops, which is a lot every time you do them. So Nexon is definitely trying to compensate you for the time you have to spend per run in hard dungeons, but once that epic gear becomes common, eventually, since even we don't like it, we'll do them anyway because, well, we have no other choice, the power ceiling will raise no matter what. So all Fair Fight does is just slow down power creep, not really circumvent it. I don't know if there's any better way to stop power creep, if it can even be fully stopped at all, because as a species, we humans naturally desire to improve, get more and more than we had yesterday, to be stronger than we were yesterday, to be better than we were yesterday. So eventually, yes, the game will scale and then things will just start becoming way too overpowered, and while Fair Fight is one of those ways to try to hold that off, it sacrifices enjoyment. If we have to spend 10 hours per week on the same dungeon over and over, that's 10 plus hours we don't have to explore other content. We're just stuck in a long perpetual prison of grinding dungeons. If you haven't noticed, the pros and cons essentially they cancel each other out, and that's kind of my point. But at least in my opinion, it's not good to implement something if it brings both good and bad. It's better to just not implement it at all, because if you have good things from that system but bad things, the bad things typically tend to outweigh the good things because of our negativity bias. The age of MMORPGs at the current moment, it's a very sensitive one. Most gamers playing this game aren't kids anymore. We don't have endless amounts of spare time like we did in the past. We have high school, college, grad school, work, obligations, kids to take care of. Yes, there are mothers and fathers who play MapleStory too. We have to use our time efficiently. We don't have that much to work with like we were back when we were 10 or 11 years old and had like 10 hours a day. which means we have to make sacrifices that can be prevented by just not having those issues at all. The fair fight system is definitely a good idea for MS2, but just not the way Nexon is doing it right now. I think it is fair to have the fair fight buff on area bosses in the Maple world, because the decrease in damage can be compensated by the number of players. Remember what I said before about how some games have dungeons where the boss's maximum HP increases based on the number of players in the dungeon, and that means the players can directly control how strong the boss can be. So in area bosses in MS2, even if our damage is reduced, we can still clear it faster and faster if more people show up, at the expense of your frames per second of course. But in dungeons where there's a fixed number of people that can enter, 4, all the fair fight system does is give us a speed limit on how quickly we can take out the boss, and while that blocks power creep to an extent, it also blocks our enjoyment. It's not fun. But anyway, that's about it. I hope you guys got something out of this, and while I think Nexon could fix up the fair fight system, let's not bash them too hard. They spend a lot of energy, resources, blood, sweat, and tears to make MapleStory 2 have a successful release, and they did, and I applaud them for that. I'm not going to nitpick every little detail about the game that I don't like. This isn't CinemaSins. I think they definitely should put it on their list of things to do for the next patch, but at the same time, let's cut them some slack. This is a great game. Let's not ruin 95% of the birthday cake that's good just because the other 5% of it is bad. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section below, and remember to be respectful. It's all well and good to have opinions, but keep that in mind. It's your opinion, and your opinion belongs to you, not to anyone else's. Don't force your opinion on others just because you disagree with them. This is mostly meant to be a channel for dialogue and discussion, not for debate. Anyways, thanks for watching guys, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care.